Hi, Humanities 200 students, and welcome to your fifth week and your video tutorial for week 5. This week we're going to be tackling a really big question, what is art? We're also thinking about art in terms of the context of the humanities in general, so we're not limiting ourselves just to those more traditional forms of art as far as paintings or works of sculpture might go, but we're thinking about it in terms of the broader picture in terms of humanities. So we're also thinking about this question within the larger context of your major project for the course, because at this point you've selected your 2 artifacts and you've been thinking about the theme that they share and how you're comparing and contrasting them and why it's important and what kind of audience you might think would be interested in this kind of examination of your 2 works of art. So asking ourselves this even bigger question of what is art is also something that ties into that final project and the work you're doing. So, like I said, it's a big question. We started the term by asking what are the humanities, and we define them in some ways to let us have a general idea of what we're going to be looking at throughout the weeks of this term. But the question of what is art is a bigger one. And to come up with a definition, a clear-cut, absolutely perfect definition of what art is a tough one. So one way we can enter the discussion of it and enter the exploration of it is to consider what art is not, in other words. So sometimes it's helpful to define something by considering the things that it is not, or it's not necessarily its opposites, but things that don't fall under its category. So one thing we've learned, and as you read through your materials this week, is that art is not scientific. It's not something that we can set a formula to, that we can create an idea that will stand the test of time no matter what. If we can't subject it to experiments that will hold up and follow a thesis in that order. So there's that element of science, element of art that is not scientific. And along the same lines, it's not a how-to. So when we study the arts and we study the humanities, we're not studying them the way we study mathematics and the sciences, in which we're trying to learn how something works or how something doesn't work. Art is not that clear cut or black and white. It's also not measurable. There are ways, of course, that we can put works of art and artifacts into particular categories based on style or time period or culture, but it's not measurable, again, in that scientific way. It's not something that can be applied as far as a formula goes. It's not something that's going to have a predictable outcome necessarily, like we think about in the sciences and math. And it's also not entirely objective. So there are some objective elements to art, again, as far as identifying it, looking at the background of an artist or a maker of an object, and also thinking about what was happening historically within the time period in which a work was created. Those things are objective and can be sort of proven. And then there are some limited elements that are objective too, where we can describe a work of art as large or small or dark. Those kind of terms can be somewhat objective. But when we get into the trickier elements of discovering what a work of art is, it's not objective. We all have different individual reactions to works of art and reflections on it, so it becomes much more subjective and personal. So we thought about what art is not, so we can also give ourselves some ideas of what art is. So we've said it's subjective, it is personal. There is definitely a personal element that comes to studying the arts, in that we can all identify certain things based on objective elements when we look at works of art, but our reaction to it, or our response to it, or our interest in it, or perhaps our repulsion to it, is personal and subjective. It's immeasurable, again, as far as measuring size and date and time period and so forth, and materials and that forth, we can measure works of art, but as far as our response to it, or the reaction, or the impact of a work of art, it is somewhat immeasurable. We can also describe art as a study of human experience. So while the sciences and the mathematics world are more a study of how things work or how to predict the way things work, a study of sort of the black and white of issues, art is where we get into that gray area, and it's more of a study of the human experience as opposed to the natural world or the scientific world. We can also think of art as a reflection of the human experience. So just like it's an examination of the world around us, many artists and our responses to works of art that they create are a reflection of that human experience, or a commentary on it, another way of looking at human experience. We can also think about the arts and the humanities in terms of how we need them as much as we need the sciences and mathematics. So rather than having you go away from this video tutorial thinking that I'm describing these two worlds, the science world and the art world, as completely opposite or different, um, I want you to think about how they actually work together and how they are actually both extremely important. We can't have one without the other. So, for example, your textbook talks about this week, that the sciences and mathematics and scientists come up with a way to build something like bulletproof glass that can protect us and can help us. So that's on the science side of things. In the arts and the humanities, if we're looking at that same larger picture, would be a study or an address of the tensions before the shooting even starts. So again, we need sort of both of them, not only the solution to danger that's presented with this scientific outcome, but also a study of why it's happening in the first place, or how else we might be able to avoid that kind of danger or tension in the future. Your text also talks about something similar to this, with the idea of that the sciences and math can calculate the flight path of a shuttle launched into space. So that's definitely something scientific, something we need the scientific minds for. But in the arts and humanities side of things, this is where we would explore man's curiosity for doing this in the first place, why man is curious about or is driven to explore um, space in the first place, or why we were so um, driven to first figure out how to fly a plane, how to create a plane. A lot of the scientific and technological developments we think of in the world um, definitely have their elements in terms of science, of course, but they're also driven by that kind of um, man's experience and curiosity or desire to accomplish those things. And lastly, I wanted to share one of my favorite parts of a film. Every time I think about this question or ponder the question of what is art, I think about the film Dead Poets Society. I don't know if you've all seen it or if you haven't seen it in a while, but there's a great scene where Robin Williams, as the professor, is talking to his students, and he's trying to get them to understand why it's important for them to study poetry and drama and art, visual art, and literature, in addition to their other courses where they're studying to become engineers or doctors or scientists. And he talks about how the sciences and the mathematics, including engineering and medicine and um, the medical field, these are all noble pursuits and they're necessary to sustain life. So he opens up that conversation by talking about just how important these studies in the sciences are. We need doctors and scientists and mathematicians. We all need them. They're necessary to sustain life. And then he says the arts and the humanities are what we stay alive for. So again, this gives you a sense of how they're sort of intrinsically linked together. And I always loved the way he phrased that, or the writer of the film phrased it, because I thought it was a great way to look at how the two are so linked and so important. When we think about the importance of one, we can't measure it without the other.